On a cold winter morning, Elena was enjoying the peace and quiet of her small home, when a faint, desperate cry echoed from the woods behind her house. The sound, somewhere between a yowl and a wail, caught her attention immediately. Curiosity led her outside, and what she saw would change her life forever. Emerging from the thick trees was a weary bobcat, thin and exhausted. Behind her, 4 tiny cubs stumbled through the deep snow, their small bodies trembling in the freezing air. The sight struck Elena to her core. What had driven this wild mother to approach her home? Winter in this remote corner of Montana had wrapped the world in a thick blanket of snow. Everything seemed frozen in time, icicles clinging to the eaves, snowflakes drifting lazily from the sky. Elena's modest cabin stood on the edge of the forest, the last human dwelling for miles. At 65, she had grown accustomed to solitude. Widowed for over a decade, Elena had learned to fill her days with quiet routines, tending to her firewood pile, repairing old quilts, and sipping tea while gazing out at the endless stretch of trees. Framed photographs of her late husband and children lined the mantel above her fireplace, a testament to a life once filled with noise and love. But now, the days were slow and predictable. This morning, like most others, Elena wrapped her hands around a steaming mug of tea, the heat soothing her chilled fingers. Through the frosted window, she watched the snow-covered trees sway gently in the wind. The serenity of the moment was interrupted by that strange, desperate sound. Setting her mug down, she grabbed her thick coat and boots, bracing herself for the biting cold as she stepped outside. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was a cry, faint but insistent, carrying an undeniable urgency. Elena trudged through the snow toward the woods, each step crunching loudly. Her breath puffed in the icy air as she scanned the trees. Near a cluster of bushes, movement caught her eye. She squinted, her heart racing as she saw a figure emerge. At first, she thought it might be a stray dog, but as the creature stepped into the open, she gasped. It was a bobcat, though its appearance was far from the sleek, powerful predator she'd seen in books. Its coat was dull and patchy, clinging to its thin frame. Its ribs were visible beneath the matted fur, and its movements were slow and labored. But what struck Elena most were the 4 cubs trailing behind it. They were tiny, barely able to walk in the deep snow. They stumbled and tripped, their small bodies shivering violently. The mother bobcat turned her golden eyes to Elena, and in them, Elena saw a mix of exhaustion and desperation. Elena froze, her heart breaking at the sight. The bobcat didn't move closer but stood her ground, her eyes locked on Elena as if pleading for help. The snow swirled around them, the cold biting at Elena's cheeks. Slowly, she knelt, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice soft and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." The mother pat didn't flinch but watched Elena carefully. After a moment, she nudged one of her cubs closer, as though offering her most fragile treasure. Elena's breath caught in her throat at the gesture. Tears pricked her eyes as she realized the gravity of the situation. These lives, so fragile and vulnerable, were now in her hands. Elena carefully removed her scarf and wrapped it around 2 of the smallest cubs, their tiny bodies barely registering the weight. She scooped up the other 2 cubs and held them close to her chest, their shivering forms pressing into her warmth. The mother bobcat followed closely, as Elena trudged back to her cabin, her movements slow but deliberate. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace enveloped them. Elena placed the cubs gently on a thick blanket she spread near the hearth. The mother bobcat collapsed beside them, her body trembling with exhaustion. Elena moved quickly, grabbing an old quilt and draping it over the family. Then, she warmed a bowl of chicken broth on the stove, placing it near the mother bobcat. The wild cat sniffed it cautiously before lapping it up, her movements deliberate but desperate. Elena watched in silence, her heart aching for the struggle this mother had endured. The hours passed as Elena cared for her unexpected guests. She cleaned the cubs' fur with a damp cloth, massaged their tiny paws to stimulate circulation, and checked each one for injuries. The mother bobcat watched her every move, her golden eyes filled with wary trust. The cubs, sensing the warmth of the fire, began to stir. Their tiny mews filled the room, a sound Elena hadn't realized she'd been missing in her quiet home. Realizing the family needed medical attention, Elena called Dr. Harper, the local wildlife veterinarian. I have a situation, Elena began, her voice trembling. She described the mother bobcat and her cubs, their condition, and her decision to bring them inside. Dr. Harper listened attentively. You did the right thing, Elena. Keep them warm and hydrated. I'll be there first thing in the morning. The night stretched on as Elena stayed by the family's side. She fed the cubs milk with a small dropper, their tiny mouths opening instinctively. You're such brave little ones, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. She stroked the mother's head gently, murmuring words of comfort. The bobcat's breathing grew steadier, and she began to relax for the first time since arriving. When morning came, Elena was relieved to see Dr. Harper's truck pulling into the snow-covered driveway. The veterinarian examined the bobcat and her cubs, her expression serious but calm. The mother is severely malnourished and dehydrated, Dr. Harper said, but with proper care, she should recover. The cubs are fragile but seem uninjured. They'll need round-the-clock care for a while. Elena nodded, absorbing every word. I'll do whatever it takes. Dr. Harper administered a vitamin injection to the mother bobcat, and left Elena with instructions on how to care for the family. Over the following days, Elena poured her heart into nursing them back to health. She prepared meals of cooked meat and milk for the cubs, ensuring they were fed every few hours. The mother bobcat, whom Elena had begun calling Lila, started to show small signs of improvement. She lifted her head more often, her eyes regaining some of their sharpness. The cubs, too, began to thrive. Each one developed a distinct personality. The smallest cub, whom Elena named Finn, was timid but curious. Maya, the boldest, often ventured away from the others, exploring the cabin with wide eyes. Nico, with his dark stripes, was playful and mischievous, while Willow, the quietest, loved to curl up near the fire. Elena's once quiet home was now filled with life and energy. She couldn't help but smile as she watched the cubs tumble over one another in playful antics, their tiny growls and squeaks filling the air. Yet her joy was tempered by the knowledge that this couldn't be permanent. You'll need to go back to the wild one day, she said softly to Lila one evening. The bobcat, resting by the fire, blinked slowly, as if she understood. As the weeks passed, Lila grew stronger. Her coat regained its luster, and her movements became more confident. The cubs grew rapidly, their playful energy sometimes overwhelming the small cabin. Elena began to prepare for the inevitable. She contacted a local wildlife rehabilitation center, explaining Lila's story and asking for guidance. When the day came to take Lila and her cubs to the center, Elena's heart was heavy. The family had become a part of her life in a way she hadn't expected. She loaded them carefully into the transport crates, her hands trembling as she closed the latches. Lila's golden eyes met Elena's through the bars, filled with a quiet understanding. At the rehabilitation center, Elena worked closely with the staff to ensure Lila and her cubs had everything they needed. Over time, the family adjusted to their new environment, where they would be prepared for eventual release back into the wild. Elena visited often, bringing fresh meat and watching from a distance as Lila taught her cubs the skills they'd need to survive. Months later, the day came for Lila and her cubs to return to the wild. Elena stood at the edge of the forest, tears streaming down her face as she watched them disappear into the trees. Lila paused once, turning back to look at Elena. It was a moment Elena would never forget, a silent goodbye that spoke volumes. Life returned to its quiet rhythm at the cabin, but it was a different kind of quiet. Elena's heart was fuller, her spirit lighter. She often thought of Lila and her cubs, imagining them thriving in the wild. On clear nights, she would sit by the fire, gazing out at the dark forest and whisper, "Be safe, Lila. Thank you for finding me."